All right, let me start out by telling you a little bit about this map that you're looking at. 17th century Europe is still Europe, and we're still looking at the same teeny tiny pocket of the world that we've been looking at for most of this whole time. Here's Rome, here's Greece in the Aegean, the ancient Near East is over here. So we're still looking at a very specific part of the world here. And again, that doesn't mean that other things aren't happening in other places. That just means that in terms of the progression of Western culture, we're really kind of bottlenecked here in Europe, at least for the 17th century. So, the Renaissance was a very busy time politically, and that continues through the 17th century. At this point in time, the Pope still technically maintains authority over most of Europe, minus, well, you see the Dutch Republic here and the Kingdom of Great Britain, they're out. Henry VIII no longer feels like he just needs to be under the purview of the Catholic Church, so he starts his own church. That's where Anglicanism comes from. The Dutch Republic here and the Germans are predominantly Protestant at this time, thanks to the influence of Martin Luther. So you can kind of draw a line through here, almost through here, and say that all of this, more or less, all the way into Portugal, really was the authority of the Pope. That being said, uh, by the time we get to the 17th century, King Louis XIV becomes the monarch of the French Empire, and he really challenges anybody who dares to place authority over him. Um, at one point in time, France was requesting to be what was referred to as the protectorate of the Catholic Church, which is a title that the Pope at the time actually gave to Charles V of Spain, which was a huge heartbreak for the King of France at the time, which was Francis I. That's the guy that you saw in that first royal portrait that we looked at. He wanted to be involved with the Pope so bad, but it didn't work out for him. So anyway, Spain remains really devoutly Catholic. Paris is somewhere in the middle. And down here in Italy, you see this is renamed, this is the Papal States. Well, this is officially the property of the Pope, but a lot of these tiny kingdoms and cities over here, a lot of that land has been divided up into um, duchies and things like that, which are now basically the property of members of the royal families from a lot of these other places as a means of establishing political alliances. So that's the world that we're dealing with today, or at least the Europe that we're dealing with at this particular point in time. Now, I love 17th century art because it's dominated by the Baroque. I give a pretty solid list of the characteristics of the Baroque and some descriptive information, so I'm not going to drag on about that all that much. I just think that this particular sculpture by Bernini, everybody just refers to him as Bernini. He doesn't really need a first name. Saint Teresa in Ecstasy. This is a great example of what made Bernini so characteristic of the 17th century. He's the perfect example of a Baroque artist. He encapsulates all four of the characteristics of the Baroque. And the documentary below the BBC special, The Power of Art, Bernini, they start out by discussing this particular sculpture. But what they don't address is the fact that he didn't just do the sculpture, but all of the adornment behind the sculpture and all the facade that you see around and the columns. He designed all that. He wasn't just a sculptor. He was also an interior designer. He did some painting. He was an architect. He did a lot of things, and he did them at a very high level. Now, he was also best friends with the Pope. As a patron in the 17th century, especially in Italy, you could not ask for a better patron to have in your pocket than the Pope. The Pope loved Bernini and his work. Bernini had a really solid relationship with the Pope. They were basically BFFs. Really a best case scenario for an artist. Now, I love the Baldacchino because it is completely unnecessary. It is unnecessary in the most baroque of ways. Not only is it unnecessary, but I believe that's 40 tons of cast bronze. At the time they were looking to cast this thing, they knew that they didn't have enough bronze available, and they ended up prying these bronze panels off of what used to be on the inside of the portico of the Pantheon, and they got a lot of the bronze that they used to cast this from the Pantheon because I really 17th century is about excess, and we already had plenty of temples. What we need is a baldacchino in St. Peter's Basilica. This is actually inside of the crossing of St. Peter's Basilica. There's a huge dome that opens up here, and I think there's a much larger one a little further down. But St. Peter's Basilica is a building we'll be looking at later. Just know that this is inside of it, and this thing is 100 feet tall. Not only is it a canopy inside of a building, that's its purpose. It's supposed to be protecting this thing, which is basically a symbol for the tomb of St. Peter's, which is actually much further below where this is at. So not only is St. Peter's tomb far below this actual floor, underneath this empty sarcophagus with a 100-foot tall canopy over it inside of a much, much larger building. Uh, Also, what's really interesting is the undulating, irregular columns that's supporting the roof of the baldacchino. That's also that irregularity is something that I find very typical of 17th century Baroque. It's also usually when you see twisted columns or twisted tree trunks or something like that, usually it's a reference to, I believe, the end of days, the final judgment. I don't really know that that has anything to do with this specifically, other than the fact that it was a pretty strong aesthetic choice. But let's move on. Yeah, here's St. Peter's Basilica from the outside. Here's that massive dome. You can put the Statue of Liberty inside the dome of St. Peter's Basilica and still have plenty of room. I probably said this about multiple other buildings at this point, but you don't get a sense of scale unless you're actually there in person. This is probably, no, I can say definitively, this is the most impressive building I have ever been inside. And for scale reference, this is the courtyard in front of St. Peter's Basilica, and all these teeny tiny dots, well, those are people. And there's a bus for scale reference too. So let's scroll back. That's what you're dealing with. Still doesn't really do justice to what it is that this building actually is in person. Just a massive undertaking. Now, all of the Vatican extends beyond St. Peter's. It's an entire complex of buildings. Kind of goes around here. In fact, this white line up here is the geopolitical border between Vatican City and the city of Rome, it was in Italy. It's under the authority of the Italian government. But everything inside of here is the Pope's property and the Pope's business. He's not subject to the authority of any larger governing body. It's just the Pope and the Vatican City, and that's all. So. Gian Lorenzo Bernini's David. I believe they talk about this in the documentary, so I'm going to briefly just say that this is supposed to be the act of David. This is the David that's in the process of throwing the stone. Another good comparison, if you compare this to either Donatello's or David's Bernini from the Renaissance, they were fairly static. They didn't have a lot of energy. It was something that was very stoic. And this is an active, energetic, I think I describe it as a whirlwind of energy. That is one of the most distinctive differences between the 17th century and the Italian, or the Renaissance, I'm sorry, is that just a sense of energy, that activity that's going on. That's that sense of drama. You know, everything that's happening is being performed right in front of you. You're just capturing this magical moment in time. All right, there's the Cornaro Chapel. This is actually the place where the St. Teresa in Ecstasy is installed, and he is responsible for everything that you see here, including two sort of concaved areas that have these sort of synthetic pews, and the Cornaro family, who paid for this chapel, have themselves represented as sculptures along the side. So it's a whole thing. It's not just the figures in the middle, it's everything. He's just creating an entire experience there. Speaking of experiences, this is Giovanni Battista Galli's The Triumph of the Name of Jesus and the Fall of the Damned. Artist name Basiccio, which sounds really nice. I'm not sure what it means, but it's probably something really insulting. This is my absolute favorite 17th century ceiling. This is a perfect example of 17th century as compared to, say, the Sistine Chapel in the Italian Renaissance. Sistine Chapel, it's mesmerizing me. It's mesmerizing. It's really impressive. but it's very static, it's regimented, it's organized. This is none of those things. This is chaos. This is the ceiling opening up to the final judgment taking place in the very instant that you exist in that particular structure. Not only that, but it's painting, its sculptural elements, and its gilded architecture. It's every part of that experience that they can manipulate. They're doing it. It's an overwhelming thing. It's something that just like the other areas of architecture, like they really don't compromise on anything because at this point they really don't feel the need to. They're trying to have as much visual impact as they can. This is a great example of 17th century Baroque artwork in general, but specifically got to be my favorite ceiling. Now, Caravaggio, that's Michelangelo Merisi del Caravaggio's. We're just going to refer to him as Caravaggio. That's the town that he was from. He gets a lot of attention in a documentary, Power of Art, Caravaggio. You'll watch that later. It's about an hour long, just like the Bernini special is. They do a really good job sort of detailing his life and who he was as a person. Well, they don't talk about. I don't think they mention this painting or the fact that this is a Vanitas image. If you look at the rotten fruit down here, especially in context to everything else that you see, it's supposed to be presenting some of the nicer things that you can have in life, um, like youth, vitality. A lot of people read a lot of sexual messages into the fact that he's using this androgynous young boy, but he had other controversies that also attracted a lot of attention. The fact that a lot of people draw attention to the fact that he seems to be seductively toying with this knot, which is keeping his robe closed. The only thing keeping us from his nude body is this knot, but really, he's got his hand resting on the knot. And yeah, he's kind of playing with it, but you can read into that what you want. The part that I do want you to pay attention to is down here, where this fruit is starting to rot. Um, that expresses that there is a temporary nature to everything, including the things that you enjoy the most. This young boy is going to turn into a gross old man. This wine is going to go bad. Everything that you can appreciate, you have to appreciate on a temporary basis, and you also have to keep in mind that at the end of your life, all of these indulgences, all of the sins that you've amassed throughout the course of your livelihood, you're going to have to answer with for those things. So it's essentially saying you can enjoy these things, but just keep in mind, like you're going to have to answer for everything at some point. Everything has an expiration date. So that's a Vanitas image. I think there's a little bit more specific information about that on Blackboard below. This is a great example of tenebrism. I give you more information about that on Blackboard below. Artemisia Gentileschi deserves her own class. She's a member of what were called the Caravaggisti, and you can tell from her sense of lighting here that she definitely knew a lot about the work of Caravaggio. Her father, Orazio Gentileschi, was an associate of Caravaggio. Um, there's so many really interesting elements of the way that their lives intertwine. Artemisia Gentileschi, I believe, is the first female artist that I have even mentioned this entire course. And I'm not mentioning her as an artist because she was a female. I'm mentioning her as an artist because she was on par with any of her male contemporaries, especially when it comes to painting the female figure. Most male artists were still a little bit timid about having nude female models, but Artemisia Gentileschi was thoroughly familiar with the female figure because she herself was a female. Her backstory is absolutely fascinating. All the things that she had to overcome, not just by being a female, but being a female under really, really difficult circumstances. She was friends, like pen pals with Galileo. She had close connections with the 17th century version. Well, it was the 17th century Medici family. She's a very, very impressive figure. But her sense of lighting also a solid demonstration of tenebrism. It's not spotlighting as much as, say, the calling of St. Matthew is, but you do have one single light source, which is apparently the brightest candle that has ever existed. But she's a very significant figure. I'll post a video. This is also a really noteworthy painting. Diego Velázquez, the official court painter of the Spanish crown. Las Meninas is a very iconic image. I'll post a video below. that'll explain a lot more information specific to that. I'll continue with the second video.